Vice Chair.
Doctor, why don't you just grab a seat here at the table, if you would, please. Our technicians will help with the microphone. It's counterintuitive, but it sounds like you're on. Don't touch anything else for a minute.
My name is Val Connor. I work with the State and Federal Contractors Water Agency. I'm their science manager. The Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program has sort of 3 tiers of organization. At the highest level is a policy group, and that's the heads of agencies like the Department of Water Resources and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the regional directors from the federal fish agencies. Department of Water Resources is Bureau of Rec. It's unique, though, in that there are multiple stakeholders. Several water districts are represented, as well as several nonprofit environmental groups. So we get our guidance for the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team from that policy group. And then
but this is initially only related to the BIOPS litigation-focused actions or response.
But it's definitely being viewed as a pilot for BDCP and trying to establish the science framework and adaptive management as we move forward.
Dr. Connor, one of the elements that our independent science board talked about in the preliminary release documents on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is that the dispute resolution process recommended there, in fact, has no end to it, because if the parties don't agree, ultimately the independent agencies exercise their authority, which means there is no dispute resolution system. Does this process have a different approach?
Well, a couple of things. One is getting everyone to agree on how to approach the science and what the conflicting conceptual models or hypotheses are, and then jointly... This
is defining the questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
So step 1 of the adaptive management cycle, yes, and then moving through, and hopefully through jointly designing these studies, there'll be broader agreement when the results come in and they're assessed.
Ultimately, the federal and state agencies who are the litigants in the party have to return to Judge O'Neill and explain what you've done, what you haven't done, and so on. What happens if there is not unanimity in the collaborative adaptive management team?
Well, if the collaborative team doesn't reach consensus, any issue would be bumped up to the policy group. But the adaptive management team itself has no authority.
The policy group is in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, is it not? The proposed Bay Delta Conservation Plan, or is that an existing policy group of the BIOPS litigation?
It's an existing, it's a new group formed out of this litigation agreement.
Okay. Would you be good enough to ship us a structure or an outline of this in the membership? I think that would help inform the council of what's going on.
Okay, I can do that.
I'm sorry. Randy.
If I could just add a thought, this is, I think, a very important step forward. Oftentimes, agencies will promulgate these regulations without local knowledge, in the absence of local knowledge, and this is provided through our consultation with a couple of the federal agencies. It's their view that it's beneficial to have biologists and scientists who have practical hands-on experience at the same table as they're developing these guidelines. And so it's still a question as to how it's going to turn out, but I think it's an important point that we're talking about here that could likely help to achieve the goals that we all agree are necessary in terms of improving the fisheries, with agency operators at the table helping with practical experience.
Any other question? I can send you the material.
Doctor, thank you very much. Thank you for just popping up and providing some supplemental information. Dr. Goodwin.
Thank you. And let's see, the last item here is another publication that we thought may be of interest to you. This has the lead author of Dr. Moyle at UC Davis. And in this paper, what they tried to do is to develop an idea of the vulnerability of fish species in California as a result of climate change. So if you look at the paper, what they did was to bring expert knowledge and a review of the literature to try and take a systematic view of each of the fish species and to make an expert judgment about how vulnerable that fish would be depending on its various life stages. And so it's a systematic approach that's described quite fully in the paper. But the take-home message, and you may have seen this in the Sacramento Bee or in your local papers, is that it did get a lot of attention because the conclusion of the paper is that native species are far more vulnerable to climate change than the exotics or the, as he called it in the paper, the alien species, to the point at which 82% of native species are currently highly vulnerable to extinction under the various climate change scenarios. So that means there's at least one life stage of that species that's absolutely critical and needs cold water. But only 19% of the alien species had that same level of vulnerability. So it's just a caution, something we should be thinking about when we start looking at landscape and how we go about conducting restoration on these species. If you have any particular questions about that, again from the science program, we have both Sam Harada and Matt Holland. And Matt's a PhD fish ecologist. They're both here if you want to catch up with them in the break. The last thing I would like to do is just to make an update on our brown bag seminars. As you know, we tend to have these seminars when there's an interesting topic or if we have access to eminent speakers who just happen to be around California. So the first one I wanted to mention is on July the 10th. And I've mentioned the authors before, or the presenters. One is Dr. Scott Brandenburg, and the other is Dr. Jonathan Stewart. They lead the geotechnical research group at UCLA. And I think this is really a wonderful example of two researchers who, most of their research is funded directly by the National Science Foundation, very, very fundamental. But a couple of years ago, they began to realize the implications of their fundamental research to California. So these are the folks that went out and did the full-scale levee testing, the levee failures. And so we asked them to come up and give a talk on two topics. The first is the potential application of their research. What happens if an earthquake centered on the delta? How are these peat soils going to respond? And of course, how will the levees sitting on top of those peat soils likely to behave? So that's the first topic they're going to cover. The other is, and I know Chair Eisenberg is a great advocate of trying to share experiences from other parts of the country and other parts of the world. And so this group of researchers has also been part of a multinational program that went out to Japan after their last big earthquake and did or participated in some of the surveys of how their levees had responded to that very major seismic event. If you recall, it was famous because of the tsunamis and the effect on the nuclear generating stations, but there was big effects on their levees as well. As they point out, they realize there's big differences. In some respects, our levees are much more vulnerable because they have water around them all the time. In Japan, many of the levees they looked at are actually dry for much of the year. But they're going to come back and report you what they learned from that exchange and probably talk a little bit about the Japanese Research Center on Earthquake Science, which is very widely regarded internationally. So that's the first one, July the 10th. And that will be in the Pagoda Building, 429 J Street in Sacramento. I'd then also like to give a trailer for the other brown bag we've got coming up in July. This will be on July the 17th. So if we could have the PowerPoint up. This talk is going to be given by Professor Roger Faulkner from the University of Cardiff in Wales. Rogers also serves as the current president of the International Association for Hydraulic Research. He also serves as the lead scientist and principal spokesman for the UK government on the Severn Barrage project. So this is probably the closest thing that is in the planning stages around the world to what we're dealing with here in the Delta. It's a massive project. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner, for those of you who know the UK, the southwest tip of England is Cornwall. To the north of that is a very large estuary going up into Wales. What this project is looking at is, can you harness the tidal energy in that estuary? And if you look at it, it looks like a long funnel. This is an area of mesotidal, very large tidal range, 22 to 30 feet tide range. When you have that amount of tidal wave, water moving up through the estuary, it acts like a siphon. And so there's a tremendous amount of tidal energy in this estuary, and it's been realized, the picture in the top right-hand corner, I think, goes back to about 1850. So this project has been around for a very long time. Largely dismissed for the reason in the bottom right-hand corner for environmental issues. If they cut off this estuary, there's no question there's going to be incredible environmental damage. What has been the game changer in the last 5 years or so is one, of course, the energy crisis that the UK has been involved in. But very interestingly, one of the most prominent environmentalists in the world, Dr. Jonathan Porritt, who was the founder of Friends of the Earth, has actually come out in support of this project. The reason for this is that he regards the biggest challenge to the world as global warming. And this one project will take out virtually all of the increase for the entire UK for about the next century. So it's massive trade-offs, just like you're facing here in California. So Roger's going to come and talk not just about the science and the engineering of this project, but how the UK government is handling this very emotional project. So that will be on July the 17th, and I thought you might be, if we can go to the next slide or take a look at the movie, if we can make this work.
Is this the gentleman, the scientist you described to me as completely outspoken, highly opinionated, very intelligent, very competent, and quite well known in the...
He's Welsh, and he's a beautiful orator, as you might expect, as the Welsh tend to be. So he's a very elegant... So this is way, way upstream, where most of the tidal energy has been dissipated. And what you're going to see, the river's still here, close to half a mile across maybe. It's also famous, if you look in the Guinness Book of Records, for the world record for surfing distance. It's some ridiculous number, 40 miles or something. So if you run the video, it's very short, about 30 seconds. But it might encourage you to come to the talk. if this project goes ahead, and as well as the environmental impacts. So you can imagine it's right on the top of the agenda for concern in the UK.
What was it? The distance that they surfed? You said 4 miles?
Oh, it's 20.
20
I forgot the
miles?
exact number. It's a long
They rode
way.
their crest in all the way?
Right. Perhaps just have a footnote as my first year teaching, I was at one of the British universities, so I took my class down to see this phenomenon, and it's very, very difficult to predict. The weather was awful. It was raining. It was about 9 o'clock at night. It was just getting dark. We showed up and stood on this bridge, and at that time, they couldn't predict the timing very well. And there was a pub right on the corner. So about 2/3 of the class you're allowed to drink at the age of 18 in the UK went in the pub for a quick beer. And this wave went past in about 30 seconds. And the river went from being virtually totally dry to right to the top of the bank. It was a really big one.
Were they downgraded in the class because of their pub involvement?
I didn't need to do that. They had a 4-hour drive back in the bus. So, one other thing I put to save the date, this is just another announcement. The State of the Estuary Conference is October the 29th to the 30th. Again, based on some of your suggestions, which we received at the last year, and we really appreciate the organizers of the conference. These conferences are now becoming more interactive with more outcomes, and we really appreciate Randy Fiorini stepping up to participate this year in the conference. So please put those on your calendar.